The year was 1589, and the most powerful woman in France was dying in agony that would make even the most hardened executioner weep. Catherine de Medici, the iron-willed queen mother who had ruled from the shadows for decades, was experiencing a death so prolonged and torturous that it seemed like divine retribution for a lifetime of alleged sins. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about how the mighty fall. For over 60 years, Catherine de Medici had been the puppet master of French politics, orchestrating marriages, wars, and according to many, assassinations with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster. She had survived religious wars, political upheavals, and countless assassination attempts, earning a reputation as one of history's most formidable rulers. Yet nothing in her arsenal of power could protect her from the enemy growing within her own body. The woman who had been accused of poisoning her enemies with exotic compounds from her native Italy was now being slowly murdered by her own flesh. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed her final months. Catherine de Medici, the alleged architect of countless deaths, was herself trapped in a body that had become her own torture chamber. This is not merely another tale of royal death, but a medical horror story that reveals the brutal reality of 16th century mortality, even for those who wielded absolute power. The accounts that survive paint a picture so disturbing that many historians have chosen to gloss over the most graphic details, preferring to focus on her political legacy rather than her biological destruction. What makes Catherine's death particularly horrifying is not just the physical suffering she endured, but the psychological torment of a woman who remained mentally sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening to her deteriorating body. She was forced to watch herself slowly decompose while still alive, a fate that seems designed by some cruel cosmic justice. The medical records and witness accounts from her final year read like something from a medieval horror manuscript. Court physicians, the most learned men of their time, were completely helpless against the biological catastrophe unfolding within the Queen Mother's body, reduced to little more than horrified observers documenting her decline. Prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's most disturbing deathbed scenes, where power, pride, and human flesh collided in the most spectacular and terrifying way imaginable. Born into the powerful Medici banking dynasty of Florence in 1519, Catherine de Medici arrived in France as a 14-year-old bride to the future King Henry II. The marriage was a political alliance designed to strengthen ties between France and the Italian city-states. But Catherine brought with her something far more valuable than doughy gold. She carried the ruthless political instincts that would define French court life for generations. When her husband died in a jousting accident in 1559, Catherine found herself thrust into a position of unprecedented female power. As queen mother to three successive kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, she became the de facto ruler of France during some of its most turbulent decades. The French wars of religion raged around her, and Catherine navigated these treacherous waters with a combination of diplomatic skill and alleged poison. Her reputation for using toxic substances to eliminate political enemies became legendary throughout Europe. Whispers followed her wherever she went, tales of perfumed gloves that killed with a touch, poisoned books that murdered their readers, and exotic Italian compounds that could mimic natural death. Whether these stories were true or merely the product of misogynistic fears about powerful women, they cemented Catherine's image as a queen who dealt in death. The court of France during Catherine's reign was a labyrinth of intrigue where survival often depended on one's ability to anticipate and counter assassination attempts. Nobles employed food tasters, avoided gifts from rivals, and lived in constant fear of the subtle hand of the poisoner. In this atmosphere of perpetual suspicion, Catherine de Medici was both the most protected and most suspected person in the kingdom. Her political philosophy was brutally pragmatic. She would align with Catholics against Protestants, or Protestants against Catholics, depending on which choice best served the stability of the crown. This flexibility earned her enemies on all sides of the religious divide, each faction convinced that she was secretly working for their destruction. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, where thousands of Protestant Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris, remains one of the most controversial events associated with Catherine's name. Whether she orchestrated the violence or merely failed to prevent it, the rivers of blood that flowed through Paris streets that August became part of her dark legacy. By the 1580s, Catherine's iron grip on French politics was beginning to weaken as age and illness took their toll. But no one could have predicted that her final enemy would come from within her own body. The first signs that something was catastrophically wrong appeared in early 1588, when Catherine began experiencing irregular bleeding that her physicians initially dismissed as the natural changes of an aging woman. At 69, she had lived far longer than most people of her era, and minor health complaints seemed unremarkable for someone of her advanced years. However, the bleeding soon became more frequent and severe, accompanied by a deep, gnawing pain in her lower abdomen that no amount of opium or herbal remedies could ease. Catherine, who had never shown weakness in the face of political enemies, found herself doubled over in agony at the most inconvenient moments, forced to excuse herself from crucial state meetings. The court physicians were baffled by her condition. Medieval medicine had little understanding of internal cancers, and the symptoms Catherine displayed, the constant bleeding, the progressive weight loss, and the increasing intensity of her pain, were beyond their ability to diagnose accurately. They resorted to the standard treatments of the time: bloodletting, purging, and an endless series of herbal concoctions that only served to weaken her further. As months passed, the mysterious ailment began to transform Catherine's physical appearance in ways that shocked even her most hardened courtiers. Her once commanding presence began to diminish as the disease literally consumed her from within, leaving her gaunt and hollow-eyed. The woman who had once struck fear into the hearts of kings was becoming a living skeleton. The pain became so severe that Catherine could no longer stand for extended periods, forcing her to conduct state business from her bed. Even sitting upright became an ordeal, and she was often forced to lie on her side while dictating letters to her secretaries, her voice occasionally breaking as waves of agony swept through her body. What made her situation even more unbearable was the gradual realization that this was not a temporary illness that would pass with time and proper treatment. The symptoms were worsening week by week, and Catherine began to understand that she was facing something her political cunning and royal authority could not overcome. The psychological impact of this powerlessness may have been even more devastating than the physical pain, as the woman who had controlled the fate of nations found herself helpless against the rebellion of her own flesh. Modern medical analysis of the historical accounts strongly suggests that Catherine de Medici was suffering from advanced uterine cancer, a disease that would have been invariably fatal in the 16th century. The tumor, growing unchecked within her reproductive organs, was not only causing excruciating pain, but also creating a cascade of secondary complications that transformed her body into a biological nightmare. The constant bleeding was likely caused by the tumor eroding through blood vessels, creating internal hemorrhages that drained her strength and left her chronically anemic. Without modern blood transfusions or iron supplements, Catherine's body was slowly starving itself of the oxygen-carrying capacity it needed to function, leaving her weak, dizzy, and increasingly unable to think clearly. As the tumor continued to grow, it began pressing against other internal organs, causing additional complications that multiplied her suffering. The pressure on her bladder made urination painful and frequent, while compression of her intestines led to chronic constipation and bloating that added to her abdominal distress. Perhaps most horrifyingly, the tumor eventually began to necrotize, literally rotting while Catherine was still alive. This process released toxins into her bloodstream and created the putrid odor that would soon make her presence unbearable even to her most devoted servants. The smell was described by witnesses as similar to that of a decomposing corpse, a particularly cruel irony for a woman accused of creating many corpses herself. The necrosis also made Catherine incredibly susceptible to secondary infections, as bacteria found easy entry points through the dying tissue. These infections caused high fevers that sent her into delirium, during which she would ramble incoherently about past events, often revealing secrets that her rational mind would never have disclosed. The combination of blood loss, toxin buildup, and systemic infection created a perfect storm of biological collapse that no medical intervention of the time could address. Catherine was essentially experiencing a slow-motion death by poisoning, administered not by an enemy's hand, but by her own malignant cells. What makes her medical situation particularly tragic is that even today, with all our advanced understanding of cancer treatment, uterine cancer that has progressed to Catherine's stage would still carry a very poor prognosis, highlighting just how utterly hopeless her situation was in 1588. The transformation of Catherine's living quarters from royal chambers into what essentially became a death house provides some of the most disturbing details of her final months. As the odor from her necrotic tumor intensified, even the most seasoned courtiers found it difficult to remain in her presence for extended periods, forcing them to hold perfume handkerchiefs to their faces during audiences. Her personal servants, bound by duty and often genuine affection for their mistress, continued to tend to her needs despite the increasingly unbearable conditions. They spoke of having to change her bedding multiple times daily due to the constant bleeding and seepage, and of burning enormous quantities of incense and aromatic herbs in a futile attempt to mask the smell of decay that seemed to emanate from Catherine's very pores. The psychological impact on those who witnessed Catherine's deterioration was profound. Hardened soldiers who had seen countless battlefield horrors were reportedly sickened by the sight and smell of the dying Queen Mother. Some of her longtime advisors began to avoid her chambers entirely, conducting business through intermediaries rather than face the living nightmare their once powerful leader had become. Catherine herself was acutely aware of the effect her condition was having on others, adding psychological torment to her physical suffering. The woman who had prided herself on commanding respect through fear and authority now inspired only pity and revulsion, a complete reversal of the power dynamics that had defined her entire adult life. Witnesses described how Catherine would sometimes catch people recoiling from her presence, and the look of humiliation and rage that would cross her wasted features was almost as painful to observe as her physical symptoms. She retained enough of her mental faculties to understand exactly what was happening to her dignity along with her body. The isolation that resulted from her condition may have been one of the cruelest aspects of her decline. The woman who had spent decades surrounded by crowds of courtiers, supplicants, and advisors found herself increasingly alone. As even her closest confidants struggled to endure prolonged exposure to her presence, her quarters, once the center of French political power, became a place that people visited only when absolutely necessary, transforming the heart of royal authority into a chamber of horrors that served as a stark reminder of mortality's ultimate democracy. As Catherine's physical condition deteriorated throughout late 1588 and early 1589, her mental state began to fluctuate wildly between moments of crystal-clear lucidity and periods of fever-induced delirium that revealed the darkest corners of her psyche. During her lucid intervals, she remained the sharp political mind that had dominated French court life, dictating letters and making decisions with the same calculated precision that had characterized her reign. However, the delirious episodes became increasingly frequent and disturbing as the toxins from her rotting tumor accumulated in her bloodstream. Witnesses reported that during these periods, Catherine would carry on animated conversations with people who had been dead for years, sometimes arguing with her deceased husband, Henry II, about political decisions, or pleading with her dead children for forgiveness. Most unnervingly, she began to confess to crimes that had never been proven, speaking in graphic detail about alleged poisonings and assassinations while in states of high fever. Her attendants recorded fragments of these confessions, though historians debate whether these represented genuine admissions of guilt or merely the product of a mind unraveling under extreme physical duress. The content of her delusional ravings often focused on the victims of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, with Catherine apparently reliving the events of that bloody August night over and over again. She would sometimes scream warnings about Protestant conspiracies or beg for mercy from accusers only she could see, her voice cracking with terror as she battled phantoms created by her own disintegrating brain chemistry. During one particularly disturbing episode recorded by her physician, Catherine allegedly described in vivid detail how she had personally selected specific individuals for assassination, providing information about methods and motives that had never been documented elsewhere. Whether these were true confessions or fever dreams remains one of history's most chilling mysteries. The psychological torture of these delirious states was compounded by Catherine's awareness during her lucid moments that she was losing control of her own mind. She would sometimes apologize to her attendants for things she had said while delirious, though she often couldn't remember exactly what those things were, leaving her in a constant state of anxiety about what secrets she might have revealed. This mental deterioration represented the final destruction of Catherine's carefully constructed public persona, stripping away decades of political calculation to reveal the raw fears and guilt that she had carried throughout her ruthless career. The final weeks of Catherine de Medici's life in January 1589 read like a medical horror story that pushes the boundaries of human endurance. As her uterine cancer reached its terminal stage, every biological system in her body began to shut down in a cascade of organ failure that left even experienced physicians nauseated by what they witnessed. The bleeding became so severe that she was essentially hemorrhaging continuously. Her bedding soaked through within hours of being changed. The loss of blood volume caused her heart to race desperately as it tried to pump the diminishing supply to her vital organs, creating a rapid fluttering pulse that could be seen visibly throbbing in her neck and temples. Her kidneys, damaged by the toxins circulating through her system, began to fail, causing dangerous fluid retention that made her extremities swell grotesquely while simultaneously poisoning her blood with waste products her body could no longer eliminate. The combination of blood loss and kidney failure created a physiological contradiction that left her simultaneously dehydrated and waterlogged. As her liver struggled to process the overwhelming toxic load from her necrotic tumor, Catherine developed the characteristic yellow tinge of jaundice, her skin taking on a sickly golden hue that made her appear almost supernatural in the flickering candlelight of her chambers. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, became clouded with the milky film of approaching death. The respiratory complications that developed in her final days added another layer of suffering to her already unbearable condition. Fluid accumulation in her lungs made every breath a struggle, creating a wet, rattling sound that could be heard from across the room and serving as a constant audible reminder of her body's systematic failure. Perhaps most cruelly, her nervous system remained largely intact throughout this biological collapse, ensuring that Catherine remained conscious and aware of every aspect of her deterioration. She could feel her body dying piece by piece while her mind remained trapped inside, fully cognizant of the horror unfolding within her own flesh. The physicians attending her documented that she would sometimes beg them to end her suffering, Though they had neither the means nor the moral framework to comply with such requests, leaving them as helpless witnesses to her prolonged agony. The final hours of Catherine de Medici's life on January 5, 1589, were marked by violent convulsions that lasted from dawn until well into the afternoon, creating a spectacle so disturbing that even her most devoted attendants were forced to leave the room. The seizures were likely caused by the complete breakdown of her brain chemistry as toxins reached critical levels in her bloodstream. Witnesses described how her body would arch impossibly backward during these convulsions, her spine curving so severely that observers feared it might snap under the pressure. Her limbs flailed uncontrollably, requiring multiple servants to hold her down to prevent her from injuring herself further, though by this point such concerns seemed almost irrelevant given her condition. Between the seizures, Catherine would regain consciousness just long enough to scream the names of people she had allegedly ordered killed, her voice carrying throughout the palace corridors and creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread among the courtiers. Some witnesses reported that she seemed to be responding to accusers that only she could see, defending herself against charges being made by invisible prosecutors. The most disturbing aspect of these final hours was Catherine's apparent lucidity during the brief interludes between convulsions. She would suddenly become coherent, looking directly at her attendants with clear recognition, as if her rational mind was surfacing momentarily from the chaos consuming her brain before being dragged back under by another wave of neurological storm. During one of these lucid moments, she allegedly whispered to her confessor that she could see flames all around her bed, though no fire was present. Whether this was a hallucination caused by her failing brain or something else entirely depends on one's perspective on such matters. But the terror in her eyes was unmistakably real to those who witnessed it. As the afternoon progressed, the intervals between seizures grew shorter, and the convulsions themselves became more violent until Catherine's body seemed to be in almost constant motion, writhing and contorting in ways that defied normal human anatomy. Her final seizure began just after sunset and continued for nearly 2 hours. When the convulsions finally stopped and Catherine de Medici's tortured breathing ceased, the silence that filled her chambers was so profound that observers later said it felt like the very air had been holding its breath, waiting for the nightmare to end. The immediate aftermath of Catherine de Medici's death revealed the extent to which her final illness had traumatized everyone who witnessed it. The physician, who had attended her final hours, reportedly suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, unable to practice medicine for months afterward, and eventually retiring from court service entirely due to recurring nightmares about his royal patient's suffering. The servants who had cared for Catherine during her final months required extensive spiritual counseling from court chaplain, many of them convinced that they had witnessed something supernatural rather than merely medical. The odor that had permeated her chambers proved so persistent that the rooms had to be sealed for weeks while various fumigation attempts were made, and even then some claimed the smell never entirely disappeared. Word of Catherine's horrific death spread quickly throughout European courts, carried by diplomats and nobles who had witnessed or heard first-hand accounts of her final months. The gruesome details were often embellished in the retelling, transforming her medical ordeal into a cautionary tale about divine justice and the dangers of wielding absolute power without moral constraint. Protestant reformers throughout Europe seized upon the circumstances of Catherine's death as evidence of God's judgment against the architect of the saint, Bartholomew's Day massacre. Pamphlets circulated describing her suffering in explicit detail, using her medical horror story as proof that divine retribution, while sometimes delayed, was always inevitable. Even Catholic sympathizers found it difficult to defend the idea that Catherine's death was anything other than a form of cosmic justice. The parallels between her alleged use of poison against her enemies and her own slow death by internal corruption seemed too precise to be mere coincidence, leading many to conclude that some higher power had crafted her punishment with deliberate irony. The psychological impact on the French court was profound and lasting. Nobles who had previously sought power through manipulation and backstabbing became notably more cautious in their political maneuvering, as if Catherine's fate had served as a warning about the ultimate consequences of ruthless ambition. Her death marked the end of an era in French politics, not just because of her personal influence, but because the manner of her dying had demonstrated that even the most powerful individuals remained subject to forces beyond their control, humbling an entire generation of would-be puppet masters. The medical aspects of Catherine de Medici's death provide a window into the primitive state of 16th century healthcare, even for the wealthiest and most powerful members of society. Despite having access to the most learned physicians in Europe, Catherine received treatment that modern medicine would recognize as not just ineffective, but actively harmful to someone in her condition. The standard medical practices of the era, bloodletting, purging, and the administration of toxic heavy metals like mercury, likely accelerated her decline rather than providing any relief. Her physicians, working within the theoretical framework of humoral medicine, interpreted her symptoms as imbalances that required correction through these aggressive interventions, essentially torturing her in their attempts to help. The autopsy performed after Catherine's death, while crude by modern standards, confirmed the presence of a massive tumor that had essentially replaced most of her reproductive organs. The examining physicians described tissue that was black as coal and corrupted beyond nature, language that suggests advanced necrosis and infection that would have made her survival impossible, even with modern medical intervention. The documentation of her case, preserved in various court records and medical treatises of the period, provides historians and medical professionals with one of the most detailed accounts of advanced cancer progression from the pre-modern era. Her symptoms and the timeline of her decline match almost perfectly with what modern oncology would expect from untreated uterine cancer. The psychological dimension of her suffering, the maintenance of mental clarity throughout physical deterioration, represents one of the cruelest aspects of her particular type of cancer. Unlike diseases that mercifully cloud the mind as they destroy the body, Catherine's tumor left her intellectually intact while systematically dismantling her physical existence. Her case also illustrates the social isolation that often accompanied serious illness in aristocratic circles, where physical weakness was seen as incompatible with political authority. The very power structures that Catherine had manipulated so effectively during her healthy years abandoned her once she could no longer project strength and control. The detailed records of her final months have provided modern researchers with valuable insights into both the medical realities of 16th century noble life and the psychological impacts of terminal illness in an era without effective pain management or palliative care. The legacy of Catherine de Medici's horrific death extends far beyond the immediate shock it caused among her contemporaries, influencing historical narratives, medical understanding, and even popular culture in ways that continue to resonate today. Her final months became a template for how historians and storytellers would later describe the deaths of other controversial historical figures, establishing a tradition of viewing suffering as potential evidence of moral judgment. The graphic accounts of her deterioration influenced the development of medical literature as physicians began to document cases more thoroughly and systematically. Partly inspired by the detailed records kept during Catherine's final illness, her case became a reference point for understanding advanced reproductive cancers. Even though the underlying mechanisms wouldn't be properly understood for centuries, in popular culture, Catherine's death has been portrayed in numerous works of historical fiction, often with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. Writers have used her medical horror story as a dramatic device to explore themes of power, corruption, and divine justice. Though many have focused more on the symbolic aspects of her suffering than on the historical medical realities, the feminist historical movement has re-examined Catherine's death through a different lens, arguing that the focus on her suffering reflects broader cultural attitudes about powerful women and the satisfaction some felt in seeing a female ruler brought low by her own biology. This perspective suggests that the emphasis on the gruesome details of her death serves to reinforce patriarchal narratives about the natural consequences of women wielding political power. Modern medical historians have used Catherine's case to illustrate the evolution of cancer treatment and the dramatic improvements in palliative care that have occurred over the past 4 centuries. Her suffering, while historically significant, also serves as a reminder of how far medical science has progressed in managing terminal illnesses. The psychological impact of her death on subsequent French rulers is evident in historical records, with several later monarchs displaying obvious anxiety about their own mortality and health in ways that seem directly traceable to the stories they heard about Catherine's final months. Her death remains one of the most well-documented examples of how political power ultimately proves meaningless in the face of biological reality. A lesson that continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about leadership, mortality, and the human condition. The story of Catherine de Medici's death forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, suffering, and human mortality that transcend the specific historical circumstances of 16th century France. Her final months represent a complete inversion of everything that defined her life. The woman who had controlled the fate of nations found herself powerless against the rebellion of her own selves. And the master manipulator, who had orchestrated countless political dramas, became the unwilling star of a medical tragedy beyond her ability to script or direct. What makes Catherine's death particularly chilling is not just the physical horror she endured, but the psychological torment of remaining mentally sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening to her. She was forced to experience the complete destruction of her dignity and authority while retaining enough consciousness to comprehend every aspect of her humiliation, creating a form of suffering that seems almost deliberately crafted by some cosmic sense of irony. The detailed historical record of her final illness serves as a brutal reminder that no amount of wealth, power, or political cunning can ultimately protect us from the vulnerabilities of human flesh. Catherine de Medici, who had spent decades believing she could control life and death through careful planning and ruthless execution, discovered that biology operates according to its own rules, indifferent to royal authority or political calculation. Her death also reveals the primitive state of medical knowledge in her era, highlighting how even the most privileged members of society were essentially helpless when faced with serious illness. The treatment she received would be recognized today as torture rather than therapy, adding layers of iatrogenic suffering to her already unbearable condition. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the way Catherine's suffering became a form of public entertainment for her contemporaries, with detailed accounts of her agony circulated throughout European courts as evidence of divine justice. This transformation of private medical horror into public moral theater speaks to humanity's complex relationship with the suffering of powerful figures. The woman who allegedly dealt in poison spent her final months being slowly murdered by her own body's toxins, creating a symmetry so perfect that it seems almost fictional. Yet the historical evidence confirms that Catherine de Medici's death was indeed far more horrifying than most of us could imagine, representing one of history's most documented examples of how the mighty can fall in the most humiliating and agonizing ways possible. In the end, Catherine de Medici's legacy is defined not just by her political achievements or alleged crimes, but by the manner of her dying, a death so terrible that it continues to shock and disturb us more than 4 centuries later, serving as an eternal reminder that power is ultimately an illusion and that we are all, regardless of our earthly authority, subject to the same biological vulnerabilities that make us human.